Close your eyes. This is a story designed to help you sleep. Tonight, you are the night watchman on a forgotten dock. The fog rolls in from the river, thick and gray, swallowing the lights of the city behind you. You have done this job for years. You know every plank, every piling, every creak of the old wooden pier. But tonight, something is different. A boat is coming. A boat with no running lights. And the cargo it carries is not meant to be seen. You are about to witness a transaction that will pull you into a hidden world of midnight shipments and secret ledgers. But first, let yourself be completely at ease. Breathe in slowly, and out. Let the rhythm of the water against the dock become the only sound. There is nothing to solve right now. Just let the story unfold, as you drift deeper into rest. The fog was the thickest you had seen in years. It came rolling in from the river just after midnight, a dense, gray wall that swallowed the far bank and erased the lights of the city beyond. One moment the air was clear, the water black and still under the faint glow of the single bare bulb that hung above the tool shed door. The next, you could barely see the end of the pier. The fog had a weight to it, a presence. It moved like something alive, curling around the pilings and drifting over the planks in slow, silent waves. It muffled the world, turning the familiar sounds of the river, the gentle lap of water against the wooden piles, the distant groan of a barge somewhere out in the shipping channel, the occasional cry of a gull, into something hushed and distant and strange. You pulled your coat tighter around your shoulders and kept walking. This was your job. It had been your job for nearly 15 years. Every night, from dusk until dawn, you walked this dock. You checked the moorings, running your hands along the ropes to make sure they were still tight. You checked the tool shed, making sure the padlock was secure and the equipment inside was undisturbed. You made sure no one had wandered in from the road, no kids looking for a quiet place to drink, no fishermen trying their luck after hours, no strangers with no good reason to be on a forgotten pier in the middle of the night. It was not complicated work. It was not dangerous work. Most nights, nothing happened at all. And that was how you liked it. You had spent enough years in the world to know that a quiet life was a gift, and you did not take it for granted. The dock was old. It had been built decades ago, back when this stretch of the river was busy with cargo boats and fishing vessels, before the new port opened downstream and the commerce moved away. Your father had worked on this dock. His father before him. The wooden planks beneath your feet had been laid by hands that were long since gone, and they had weathered decades of rain and sun and the slow, patient gnawing of the river. They creaked with every step you took, a sound as familiar to you as your own heartbeat. You knew this dock the way a captain knows his ship. You knew which boards groaned when you stepped on them, which pilings had been replaced after the flood of '08, which ropes had frayed and which ones still held. You knew the exact spot where the old ferry used to tie up, the iron cleat still bolted to the wood, worn smooth by years of use. You knew the smell of the river at different times of year, the clean, cold smell of winter, the muddy richness of spring, the faint, green scent of algae in the heat of August. Tonight, the air was cool and damp, and it carried the faint, metallic tang of autumn. The river was a dark, silent presence to your left. The fog sat on its surface like a lid, and the water beneath was invisible. You could hear it, though, the slow, steady rhythm of the current, the occasional soft slap of a wavelet against the wooden piles. It was a comforting sound. A constant sound. A sound that had been the background of your life for as long as you could remember. As a boy, you had sat on this very dock with your father, your legs dangling over the edge, watching the boats go by. He had pointed out the different vessels, the barges, the tugs, the fishing boats with their nets spread out to dry. He had taught you the names of the birds that nested under the pier. He had told you that the river was older than the city, older than the people who lived on its banks, older than memory itself. And he had told you that a watchman's job was not just to guard the dock, but to listen. To pay attention. To notice when something was not right. You were at the far end of the dock, near the old ferry slip, when you heard it. Not the river. Not the wind. Something else. A low, mechanical rumble, barely audible at first, but growing steadily louder. It was coming from the water. From somewhere out in the fog. You stopped walking. You turned off your flashlight and stood very still, listening. The rumble deepened. It was an engine. A boat engine, throttled down to a low, quiet murmur. And it was getting closer. You knew the sound of every boat that still ran on this river. The old tug that pushed barges upstream, its diesel engine chugging like a tired heart. The fire department's rescue skiff, high and whining. The occasional Coast Guard cutter, deep and powerful. But this was none of those. This was smaller. Quieter. A sound you had not heard before, smooth and well-maintained, the kind of engine that belonged to a private vessel, something expensive, something that did not normally come to this part of the river. And it was running without lights. No red and green running lights on the bow. No white stern light. Not even the faint glow of a cabin lamp. Just the sound, growing closer in the fog. You watched the fog. The engine sound grew louder, then shifted. Someone had put it in neutral. There was a soft, wet bump, the unmistakable sound of a hull touching wood. The boat had pulled up to the dock. Right at the far end of the ferry slip, where the water was deepest and the pilings were reinforced with iron. You waited for a voice, a shout, the sound of a line being thrown. Nothing. Only the soft, steady idling of the engine and the gentle bump of the hull against the pilings as the boat rocked in its own wake. Then, from the fog, a hand appeared. It reached out of the gray, a bare hand, no glove, the skin pale in the faint light of the distant tool shed bulb, and placed a wooden crate on the edge of the dock. The movement was deliberate but unhurried, as if whoever was on that boat had done this before, many times. On one finger was a silver ring, and on the ring was a symbol you could not quite make out in the darkness. The crate was heavy, you could tell by the way it landed, solid and final, the sound of its weight absorbed by the thick fog. Then the hand withdrew into the mist, and the engine rumbled again, and the boat pulled back into the fog before you could speak, before you could move, before you could do anything but stare at the crate sitting on the dock at your feet. The fog swallowed the sound of the engine as completely as if it had never been there at all. The river was silent again. You were alone on the dock with a crate that had come out of nowhere, delivered by a hand that had asked no questions and left no answers. You knelt down beside it, your knees pressing into the damp wood of the dock. The crate was small, no larger than a toolbox, but it was solid, made of rough, unfinished pine that had been nailed together with care. There were no markings on it. No shipping labels. No custom stamps. No address. Just a single symbol, drawn in white chalk on the top. A circle, and inside the circle, a shape you could not quite identify. The same symbol you had glimpsed on that silver ring, glinting for just a moment before it vanished into the fog. You did not know what it meant. But you had a feeling, quiet and certain, that you were going to find out. The crate sat on the dock where the hand had left it, dark and solid against the swirling gray of the fog. You stood over it for a long moment, your flashlight trained on its rough wooden surface. The beam illuminated every detail, the grain of the pine, the small knots in the wood, the faint traces of sawdust still clinging to the edges. The river lapped softly against the pilings below you, a sound so familiar that you barely noticed it anymore, as constant as your own breathing. But the crate was not familiar. The crate was something new. Something that did not belong on this quiet, forgotten dock in the middle of the night. Something that had been delivered by a hand that had asked no questions and left no answers. You knelt down and gripped it by the edges. The wood was damp and cold from the fog, rough against your palms, and the crate was heavier than it looked. Much heavier. You lifted it with some effort, cradling it against your chest like a burden you had not asked to carry, and carried it back along the dock toward the tool shed. Your footsteps were slow and careful, each step measured against the familiar creak of the planks beneath your weight. The fog pressed in around you, muffling every sound except the steady rhythm of your own movement and the distant, mournful call of a foghorn somewhere out on the shipping channel. The single bulb above the shed door glowed dimly through the mist, a pale amber beacon in the darkness, guiding you home. The tool shed was a small, cluttered space that smelled of rust and old rope and the faint, oily scent of the kerosene heater you sometimes used in winter. It was not much, just 4 walls and a roof, a place to store equipment and take shelter from the rain. But tonight, it felt like a sanctuary. You pushed the door open with your shoulder and stepped inside, letting the familiar smells wrap around you. Shelves lined the walls, stacked with paint cans and coiled hoses and boxes of nails and screws, their Abel's faded and peeling. A heavy wooden workbench ran along the back wall, scarred by decades of use, cuts from saw blades, dark rings from coffee cups, the faint impression of a hammerhead where someone had once struck too hard. You set the crate down on the bench, the wood groaning under its weight, and pulled the cord on the overhead lamp. The bulb flickered once, twice, and then steadied, casting a pool of yellow light across the workbench and the crate in your hands. You stood there for a moment, studying the crate in the light. It was made of rough pine boards, nailed together with care but not with precision. The nails were old-fashioned, square-headed, the kind you didn't see much anymore. Whoever had built this crate had wanted it to hold, not to look pretty. They had measured each board, cut each corner, driven each nail with a purpose. There were no markings on any of the sides, no shipping labels, no custom stamps, no addresses scrawled in marker or paint. Nothing to indicate where it had come from or where it was supposed to go. Just the symbol on the top, drawn in white chalk. You leaned closer, your breath stirring the chalk dust. The symbol was a circle, and inside the circle was a shape that looked almost like a bird in flight, or perhaps a key. It was hard to tell. The chalk lines were thick and slightly smeared, as if they had been drawn quickly, confidently, by someone who had done this many times before and knew exactly what they were doing. You reached for the crowbar that hung on a hook above the workbench. It was an old tool, its handle worn smooth by years of use, its tip slightly bent from some long-forgotten job. Its weight was familiar in your hand. You wedged the tip beneath the edge of the crate's lid and pressed down. The nails gave with a low, creaking groan, the sound of wood resisting, then yielding. You worked the crowbar along the edge, loosening each nail in turn, until the lid lifted enough for you to get your fingers underneath. You pulled it the rest of the way with your hands, setting it aside on the bench. Inside, packed tightly together, were bundles wrapped in brown oil paper. They filled the crate completely, wedged in so snugly that nothing could shift. Each bundle was about the size of a brick, and each was tied with cotton string that had yellowed with age. You lifted one out. It was heavy. Dense. The oil paper was waxy and slightly greasy to the touch, the kind of paper used to protect ings from moisture and time, the kind of paper that was meant to preserve whatever was inside for a very long time. You untied the string and folded back the paper. Inside was money. Not the money you carried in your wallet, the familiar green bills with their portraits of presidents and their crisp, modern feel. This money was older. Much older. The paper was thick and fibrous, closer to cloth than to modern currency, and it had a faint, musty smell, the smell of paper that had been stored in a dry, dark place for decades. The colors were muted, faded by time to deep browns and pale greens and a watery orange that might once have been gold. The designs were intricate, ornate borders, classical figures, eagles and shields and scrollwork. The denominations were large. $500. 1,000. 5,000. Numbers that seemed to belong to another world entirely. The dates stamped on the bills were from decades ago, before you were born. And the names of the banks that had issued them were names you had never heard of, banks that had failed during the Great Depression, banks that had been bought and sold and merged and swallowed by larger banks until nothing remained of them but these pieces of paper. Each bill was a relic. A piece of history. A ghost of a financial system that no longer existed. You counted. Slowly. Carefully. Bundle by bundle, brick by brick, bill by bill. The work was methodical, almost meditative. The only sounds were the soft rustle of the oil paper, the whisper of old currency against your fingertips, and the steady, patient lapping of the river against the dock outside. The pile of counted bundles grew on the workbench beside the crate. When you finished, you sat back on the old wooden stool that had been in the corner of the shed for as long as you could remember, and you stared at the numbers you had written on a scrap of paper. Nearly $500,000. Sitting in a crate on your workbench. Delivered by a hand in the fog. You looked at the money. You looked at the crate. You looked at the symbol drawn in chalk on the lid, the circle, the bird, the key. The fog was still out there. You could see it through the small window of the tool shed, pressing against the glass like something patient, something waiting. The river was invisible, but you could hear it, the slow, steady rhythm of the water against the dock, the occasional distant groan of a barge somewhere out in the darkness. Whatever was happening, it was not over. It had only just begun. And somewhere, out in the fog, a hand with a silver ring had already disappeared back into the night, leaving you with a question you did not yet know how to ask. The money sat in neat stacks on the workbench, its muted colors, deep browns, faded greens, watery oranges, strange and unsettling under the yellow glow of the overhead lamp. You had counted every bundle, every brick of oil paper, every bill. The total was still settling into your mind like a stone dropped into still water. Nearly $500,000. Delivered by a hand in the fog. But something else was bothering you, a quiet nagging at the edge of your thoughts. The crate was empty now, or nearly empty. You had lifted out all the bundles, one by one, until your fingertips had brushed against the rough, splintered wood of the bottom. And there, flat against the base of the crate, hidden beneath the last layer of currency, was something else. A book. A ledger. You reached in and lifted it out with both hands. It was heavier than you expected, its weight out of proportion to its size. The binding was dark leather, cracked and softened with age, its surface marked with faint scratches and the ghost of a label that had long since peeled away. The corners were rounded from years of handling, worn smooth like river stones. The spine had been reinforced with strips of cloth tape, carefully applied in neat, parallel lines. Someone had repaired this book. Someone had wanted it to last. Someone had placed it at the very bottom of the crate, beneath $500,000 in old, forgotten currency, as if it were the most important thing of all. You set it on the workbench beside the stacks of money. The overhead lamp buzzed softly, its yellow light pooling on the worn leather cover. Outside, the fog pressed against the small window of the tool shed, thick and gray and patient. The river lapped gently against the pilings, a sound so constant that it had become a kind of silence. You listened to it for a moment, letting the rhythm settle your thoughts. Then you opened the ledger. The binding crackled faintly, a sound like dry leaves stirring in a breeze. The pages inside were yellowed and brittle at the edges, and you had to handle them with care, turning each one as gently as you might turn the wing of a moth. The ink was black, faded now to a soft, watery brown, but still perfectly legible. It was written in a careful, deliberate hand, the letters formed with precision and patience. Not the hurried scrawl of a dock worker filling out a manifest at the end of a long shift. This was the hand of someone who took their time. Someone who wanted things recorded properly. Someone who understood that these words might matter, someday, to someone. The entries were organized in neat columns. A date. A ship name. A cargo description. A destination. The earliest entries were from the late 1950s, the ink still dark and crisp against the page. The cargoes were ordinary enough at first glance: lumber from the mills upriver, machinery bound for factories in the south, textiles and canned goods and sacks of grain. The destinations were familiar: cities up and down the coast, ports you had seen on maps, places where legitimate cargo might go. But as you turned the pages, moving forward through the years, the descriptions began to change. The cargoes became vaguer, less specific. Mixed goods, miscellaneous, special order. The handwriting never wavered, but the words themselves grew cautious, evasive, as if the writer had learned not to say too much. The destinations shifted too. They became ports you had never heard of, cities and countries that no longer existed on any map. The 1960s gave way to the 1970s, and the entries continued, careful, methodical, unbroken. The handwriting remained the same through all of it. Whoever had kept this book had been at it for nearly 20 years. That kind of consistency spoke of discipline, of dedication, of secrets that were meant to outlast the person who kept them. The foghorn sounded again, somewhere far out on the river, a low, mournful note that seemed to hang in the air for a long time before fading. The tool shed creaked softly as the wind shifted outside. You pulled your coat a little tighter and turned another page. The cargoes grew stranger still. Medical supplies, agricultural equipment, printed materials. These were not the kinds of things that smugglers usually carried, not guns, not drugs, not contraband liquor. They sounded almost legitimate, almost innocent. But the evasive language, the careful omissions, the destinations in far-flung ports, they all told a different story. Whatever this ledger was recording, it was not ordinary trade. And then, on the last page, the entries stopped. The final line was dated 1972. The ink was the same, the handwriting the same, but something about it felt different. Heavier. The cargo was listed as machine parts, bound for a port in Southeast Asia, a place that, you happen to know, had been in the middle of a war at the time. And beside this final entry, in the margin, written not in ink but in pencil, was a single word. The graphite was faint, almost smudged away by the passage of years, but you could still read it. Abandoned ship. You stared at those words for a long moment. 2 words, written in pencil, beside the last entry in a ledger that had been hidden at the bottom of a crate of old money. Abandoned ship. The phrase echoed in your mind like the distant foghorn. The boat in the fog, the hand with the silver ring, had delivered a crate with a ledger that ended with those words. Whatever this book was, it was not just a record of cargo. It was the log of something that had gone wrong. Something that had ended in 1972, with an order to abandon ship. You were about to close the ledger when you felt something shift inside the back cover. A small movement, a faint rustle, as if something was tucked away where it was not meant to be seen. You turned to the last page and ran your fingers along the binding, feeling the slight give of the leather. There was a bulge beneath the end paper, something flat and solid, pressed into the space between the cover and the pages. You worked it free, carefully peeling back the brittle edge of the paper. It was a key. Brass. Old-fashioned. Heavy. It had been taped to the inside of the back cover with a strip of adhesive that had yellowed and dried with age. The tape crumbled at your touch, and the key fell into your palm with a soft, metallic weight. It was larger than an ordinary key, its shaft thick and solid, its bow shaped like a simple oval. It had been machined with care, the edges smooth, the surface polished by years of handling. And on the bow, engraved in tiny, precise numbers, was a code. 1. Not a date, you were certain. You had seen enough dates tonight, in the ledger, on the old currency, to know the difference. This was something else. A serial number, perhaps. A locker number. A safe deposit box. The key was heavy in your hand, cold and solid. It was a key that had been hidden, deliberately, in a book that had been hidden in a crate that had been delivered by a hand in the fog. It was a key that had been waiting. And as you sat there in the tool shed, It the river lapping against the dock and the fog pressing against the window and the stacks of old money surrounding you on the workbench, you knew that the key was the next piece. The next question. The next door. The brass key was still warm in your palm from where you had been holding it, turning it over and over between your fingers. The number engraved on its handle, 1982, seemed to glow in the yellow light of the overhead lamp, its tiny, precise digits catching the glare like a whispered secret. But you did not yet know what it opened. You did not yet know where to look. And so, while the fog pressed against the small window of the tool shed and the river lapped softly against the pilings outside, a sound as steady and patient as your own breathing, you turned your attention back to the ledger. You had been so focused on the entries, the dates, the cargoes, the destinations, the careful columns of ink that stretched across the decades, that you had barely glanced at the first few pages. They were different from the rest. Thinner. More fragile. The paper at the very front of the book was of a slightly different texture, as if it had been added later, or perhaps had been the original pages before the ledger was repurposed for its secret purpose. Not records of shipments, but something else. Something more personal. You turned back to the very beginning, to the page before the columns began, where the binding was still tight and the paper had not been handled as often. And there, tucked into the fold of the binding, its edges just barely visible against the yellowed page, you found a small piece of cardstock. It was old. Older than anything else you had found tonight. The cardstock had yellowed to the color of weak tea, and its edges were soft and frayed from years of being pressed between the pages. A photograph was stapled to one corner with a rusted metal staple that left an orange-brown stain on the paper. An old photograph, black and white, faded by time to shades of gray and sepia, its surface slightly glossy from the chemicals used to develop it long ago. It showed a man in a uniform, the same uniform you were wearing right now. The dark wool coat with the brass buttons, EA. CH1 embossed with the emblem of the dock authority. The peaked cap with the same emblem on the front, a small anchor surrounded by a wreath of laurel leaves. He was standing on this very pier, his hand resting on the same wooden railing you touched every night on your rounds. You recognized the spot immediately, the slight warp in the top rail, the iron cleat just behind his left shoulder. It was the ferry slip. The same place where the boat had pulled up tonight, where the hand had reached out of the fog and left the crate. Below the photograph, typed on the cardstock in the formal, slightly uneven letters of an old manual typewriter, was a name and a title. The name was not yours. You had never seen it before, had never heard it spoken by any of the old-timers who sometimes came down to the dock to fish or to reminisce. But the title was exactly yours. Night Watchman, River Dock Number 4. Your dock. Your title. Your job, held by a man you had never known, in a time before you were born. You stared at the photograph for a long moment. The man's face was difficult to make out, the photograph was small, and the years had not been kind to its resolution, but you could see enough. He was older than you, with deep lines around his eyes and a chin that jutted forward with a quiet determination. He looked like a man who had spent his life on the river. A man who had seen things, and kept them to himself. His uniform was identical to yours, right down to the brass buttons, and the pier beneath his feet was the same pier you walked every night. Even the tool shed in the background of the photograph, its door propped open, its roof slightly sagging in the same place it sagged now, was the same shed you were sitting in at this very moment. The photograph had been taken from roughly the angle of the old lamppost near the ferry slip. You had stood in that exact spot 100 times. You turned the card over. The back was blank except for a single line of handwriting. The paper had browned with age, and the ink had faded to a pale, rusty brown, the color of dried leaves in late autumn. But the words were still legible, written in the same careful, deliberate hand that had filled the ledger's columns. The key is in the lighthouse. A watchman's last watch is to turn on the light. You read it twice. 3 times. The words did not change. They sat there on the card, quiet and patient, as if they had been waiting for you to find them for a very long time. The lighthouse. Of course. You knew exactly where it was. Everyone who lived along this stretch of the river knew the old lighthouse. It stood on a rocky point about 2 miles downstream, where the river bent sharply toward the sea. It had been built in the 1880s, back when this waterway was a major shipping route, and for decades its beam had guided vessels safely through the treacherous currents. But it had been abandoned for as long as you could remember. The light had gone out decades ago. The tower was rusted and boarded up, its windows covered with sheets of plywood that had warped and rotted over the years. It was surrounded by a rusted chain-link fence with a padlock that no one had opened in 30 years. No one ever went there. There was no reason to. The shipping channel had been moved, the port had been relocated downstream, and the lighthouse was just a relic, a crumbling monument to a past that no one remembered. But the note said the key was there. And the key in your hand, the brass key with the number 1982 engraved on its handle, was waiting to be used. 1982, 10 years after the last entry in the ledger. 10 years after the order to abandon ship. Whoever had written that note had known something. Something that had survived the abandonment. Something that had been waiting all this time for someone to find it. You thought about the other night watchman. The man in the photograph, the first, perhaps, or one of the first. He had worn this uniform and walked this pier. He had kept the ledger, or someone like him had. And then, at the end of his watch, he had passed it on. To the next watchman. And the next. Each one adding their own entries, their own secrets, their own small piece of the story. The ledger had been their logbook. Their record. Their way of telling whoever came after that there was something worth guarding. If your eyes are growing heavy, if the rhythm of the river is beginning to blur the edges of your thoughts, then let them. The fog will still be there when you wake. The ledger will still be there. The lighthouse has been waiting for 30 years. It can wait a little longer. Close your eyes. Let the water carry you for a while. You set the card down beside the ledger and looked out the small window of the tool shed. The fog was still thick, a dense gray wall that obscured everything beyond the edge of the dock. But the sky was beginning to lighten in the east, the first faint hint of dawn, a pale, milky glow that was just barely visible through the mist. The night was almost over. You would not go to the lighthouse tonight. It was too dark, too dangerous, and you were too tired, the weight of the night's discoveries pressing down on your shoulders like a physical burden. But tomorrow night, when the fog rolled in again and the river turned black under the moon, you would take the brass key and the ledger and the photograph. You would walk those 2 miles along the riverbank, following the old path that the watchman before you must have walked 100 times. And you would find out what the last watchman had left behind. What he had meant when he wrote that a watchman's final duty was to turn on the light. The fog was thinner the second night. Not gone, the fog on this river was never truly gone in late autumn, when the water was still warm from the long summer and the air had turned cold and sharp. It lingered in the hollows along the bank, drifted in pale ribbons across the gravel path, caught itself on the bare branches of the trees like fragments of a dream that had not quite ended. But it was lighter than the night before. You could see the moon through it now, a thin crescent, sharp as a fishbone, hanging low over the river. And you could see the stars, scattered across the dark sky like grains of salt thrown across black stone. You had waited all day for the sun to set, the brass key heavy in your pocket, its weight a constant reminder of the task ahead. The photograph of the old watchman was tucked into the ledger, which you carried under your arm, wrapped in its oilcloth. The note about the lighthouse, a watchman's last watch is to turn on the light, echoed in your mind with every step. Now, with the river black and silent to your left and the gravel path crunching softly beneath your boots, you were walking the 2 miles downstream. The path was overgrown. It had been years since anyone had maintained it, decades, perhaps. Brambles and wild grasses reached across the trail, their stalks wet with dew, brushing against your coat as you passed. You had to duck under low-hanging branches, push through patches of nettles that stung your wrists. The path had once been a proper walkway, you remembered. There were remnants of an old wooden boardwalk in places, the planks rotted and collapsed, the nails rusted to orange dust. Your father had walked this path. You knew that now, though you had not known it when you were a boy, when he had brought you this way on summer afternoons, carrying a fishing rod and a hamper of sandwiches. He had never told you about the lighthouse. He had never told you about any of it. But he had walked this path, many times, and now you were walking it too. The river kept you company on your left, its soft, steady murmur a familiar presence in the dark. The water was low tonight, and you could see the mudflats glistening along the bank, the exposed roots of the willows that lined the shore. A fish jumped somewhere out in the darkness, its splash startling in the quiet. An owl called from the woods on the far side of the river, a low, hollow sound that seemed to hang in the air for a long time before fading. Ahead, the rocky point jutted out into the water like a stone finger pointing toward the sea. And on it, rising against the night sky, was the lighthouse. It was taller than you remembered. You had not seen it up close in years, not since you were a boy, walking this same path with your father on those long-ago summer days. It had seemed smaller then, less imposing. Now, it rose above you like a monument to something forgotten. The tower was made of old brick, its surface weathered and streaked with dark stains from decades of rain and wind and salt spray. The mortar between the bricks had crumbled in places, and tufts of grass grew from the cracks. The light at the top had been dark for 30 years. The great glass panes of the lantern room were covered with sheets of plywood that had warped and rotted, and some had fallen away entirely, leaving gaps through which you could glimpse the darkness within. A rusted chain-link fence surrounded the base of the tower, its posts leaning at odd angles where the ground had shifted over the years. A faded metal sign hung from the gate, its letters barely legible, "Danger. Keep out." But the padlock on the gate was old. Older than the sign, perhaps. It was a heavy, rusted thing, its shackle pitted and corroded by years of salt air and rain. When you touched it, the metal crumbled in your hand like dried clay, and the gate swung open with a low, reluctant groan that seemed to echo across the water. You crossed the overgrown yard to the lighthouse door. The weeds here were waist-high, thick with thistles and the dry, brown stalks of last summer's wildflowers. The door was solid iron, rusted at the edges, its surface rough and pitted. Someone had wrapped a heavy chain around it, securing it to an iron ring set into the stonework. The chain was newer than the fence, still rusted, but not as deeply, and it was held together by a padlock. A newer padlock. You pulled the brass key from your pocket, feeling its familiar weight in your palm. The number 1982 glinted in the moonlight. You fitted the key into the lock, turned it, and felt the mechanism release with a soft, satisfying click that you felt in your bones. The chain fell away, clanking against the iron door. The door opened into darkness. The air that spilled out was cold and still, smelling of damp stone and rust and something else, something faint and sweet, like old tobacco, like the ghost of a pipe smoked long ago. You switched on your flashlight and stepped inside. The ground floor of the lighthouse was a single round room, its walls curved and damp. A wooden workbench stood against one wall, its surface cluttered with old tools, a wrench, a hammer, a box of nails fused together by rust. A pot-bellied stove sat in the corner, its door hanging open, cold ashes spilling onto the stone floor. And directly ahead, winding upward around the central column in a tight spiral, was the staircase. You began to climb. The steps were iron, bolted into the brick, and they groaned beneath your weight. Dust lay thick on every surface, a soft, gray blanket that had been undisturbed for decades. Your flashlight swept the stairs ahead, illuminating the dust, the cobwebs, the dark streaks of moisture on the walls. The climb was longer than you expected. The staircase seemed to go on forever, spiraling upward into the darkness above. And then you saw the footprints. In the dust. Recent footprints, clear and sharp, leading upward. Someone had been here. Someone had climbed these stairs, days ago, perhaps weeks, but not years. The prints were too distinct for that. They had not yet been settled by time or wind or the slow, patient accumulation of dust. Your heart beat a little faster, but not with concern. With something closer to curiosity. to recognition. You continued upward, following the footprints. The staircase ended at a heavy wooden trapdoor set into the ceiling. You pushed it open. It was heavier than it looked, the wood swollen with moisture, and emerged into the lantern room at the top of the tower. The room was circular, walled with glass panes that had once looked out over the river and the sea beyond. Now, most of the glass was grimy with decades of salt spray and soot, and some of the panes were cracked or missing entirely. But a few of the boards that had covered the windows had been pried loose, letting in slivers of moonlight that cut across the dusty floor like silver blades. The great Fresnel lens sat in the center of the room, a massive construction of brass and glass, its fittings tarnished to a dull green, its crystal faces cracked and clouded. It had not been lit in 30 years. It was a relic, a monument, a thing that had once saved lives and now gathered dust. But around the lens, arranged on a low wooden table that had been pulled up beside it, were other things. Things that did not belong in an abandoned lighthouse. A telegraph key, its brass file. Things polished to a dull gleam, far cleaner than anything else in this room. A set of headphones, their leather ear pads cracked but intact, hanging from a hook on the side of the table. A coil of copper wire. A small, portable shortwave radio, its dials still turning, its batteries long since dead. And a notebook. Small, bound in dark leather, its pages yellowed but intact. Someone had been using this room recently, and they had been using it to listen. You picked up the notebook and opened it. The pages were filled with columns of numbers and letters, code. Rows and rows of it, written in the same careful hand that had filled the ledger. Each entry recorded a date, a frequency, and a string of characters that meant nothing to you. But at the back of the book, on the last few pages, was something different. A list of names. Real names, not code. And beside each name, a word. Pelican. Heron. Kingfisher. Osprey. Not birds. You understood that now. These were ships. The vessels from the ledger. The boats that had carried the secret cargoes through the fog, year after year, decade after decade. And the names beside them, the code names, were the Watchmen. The keepers of the code. The men who had guarded the secret and passed it down. Your finger traced down the list, past the names you did not recognize, past the code names you were only beginning to understand. And there, at the very bottom, written in the same careful hand, was a name you knew better than any other. Your father's name. And beside it, his code name. Owl. You stood there in the cold, dark lantern room, the notebook trembling slightly in your hand. The telegraph key was silent. The radio was dead. The great lens behind you was dark and cold. But the code was still here. The list was still here. And at the bottom of that list, waiting for you all these years, was your father's name. Owl. The watchman who sees in the dark. Who had seen all of this before you, and had never told you. And now, somehow, you have become what he was. The next name on the list. The next keeper of the code. The notebook lay open in your hands, its pages filled with the careful columns of code that your father had written years ago. The list of names and code words was still fresh in your mind: pelican, heron, kingfisher, osprey, and at the bottom, your father's own name beside his call sign: owl. You stood in the cold, dark lantern room at the top of the lighthouse, the great Fresnel lens silent and dark behind you, the river rushing past far below. The moon had set, and the only light came from your flashlight, propped on the wooden table, casting long shadows across the curved walls. The notebook was more than just a list. It was a manual. The first pages, which you had only glanced at before, contained detailed instructions, frequencies, times, protocols. Someone had written them in the same careful hand that filled the ledger and the codebook. Your father's hand. He had documented everything: how to operate the shortwave radio, when to listen, what to listen for. And according to his notes, the radio was still here. You turned and looked again at the equipment on the table. The telegraph key, its brass fittings polished. The headphones, their leather ear pads cracked but intact. The coil of copper wire. And beside them, half hidden beneath a dusty canvas cover, was the shortwave receiver. You pulled the cover away. Dust puffed into the air, swirling in the beam of your flashlight. The receiver was old, an analog model, heavy and solid, its metal casing scratched and dented from years of use. Its dials were stiff with age, its speaker grill caked with grime. It looked like it had not been turned on in decades. But when you traced the power cord to the wall, you saw that it was plugged into a battery pack, also old, but still showing a faint charge on its indicator light. Someone had maintained this equipment. Someone had made sure it would still work. You followed the instructions in the notebook. You connected the antenna wire to the receiver, running it out through one of the broken window panes into the cold night air. You turned the dial to the frequency listed on the first page, 4125 kHz, the maritime band, the channel that ships used to communicate with shore stations in the days before satellite phones. You put on the headphones, adjusting the cracked leather pads over your ears. The world went quiet. The river, the wind, the creak of the old lighthouse, all of it faded, replaced by a soft, steady hiss of static. You sat there for a long time, listening to the white noise, watching the second hand of your wristwatch creep toward the appointed hour. According to the notebook, the transmissions came at irregular intervals, but always between midnight and 2 in the morning, and always on this frequency. The static hissed and crackled. The headphones pressed against your ears. Outside, the river flowed past in the darkness, patient and eternal. And then, faintly, almost imperceptibly at first, you heard something beneath the static. A voice. Not a human voice, not exactly. It was a synthesized voice, mechanical and flat, the kind used by automated weather stations and navigation beacons. It was reading numbers. Numbers, and then words. Code words. You grabbed the pencil from the table and began to write, copying down the numbers as they came, your handwriting shaky from the cold and the adrenaline. The voice repeated the sequence 3 times, then fell silent. The static returned. You sat very still, the headphones still on, waiting to see if there would be more. But there was nothing. The transmission was over. Your hands were trembling slightly as you opened the codebook. The first page contained a simple cipher, a table matching each code word to a letter of the alphabet, each number to a prearranged phrase. You worked through the sequence you had written down, decoding it line by line. And then you stopped. The message read, "Owl calling Pelican. Second shipment dispatched. Destination, Port of San Francisco. Delivery, standard protocol. Owl. Your father's call sign." Your father had been dead for 15 years. But his message was still broadcasting. Still repeating, week after week, month after month, year after year. A ghost in the machine. A voice from beyond the grave. And someone, somewhere, was still listening. The harbor bar was not the kind of place you went for the atmosphere. It was a low, dark room tucked into the ground floor of an old warehouse at the edge of the dock district, its windows fogged with decades of cigarette smoke, its wooden bars scarred and polished by the elbows of 1,000 longshoremen and fishermen and night watchmen who had come and gone over the years. The beer was cheap, the lighting was dim, and the jukebox in the corner had been broken since before you started working on the dock. But it was the place where the old-timers gathered, the men who had worked the river when the port was still busy, who remembered the names of boats that no longer sailed, who could tell you stories about the way things used to be. You had come here looking for one man in particular. His name was Eddie, and he had been a dock worker for more than 40 years before his knees gave out and he retired to a small apartment above a laundromat on 3rd Street. He still came to the harbor bar most evenings, nursing a single glass of whiskey and holding court at the end of the bar, his voice rough as gravel, his memory sharp as a tack. If anyone knew about the code names in your father's notebook, it would be Eddie. You found him in his usual spot, a hunched figure in a faded flannel shirt, his hands wrapped around a glass of Jameson. You sat down beside him and ordered a beer. For a while, you talked about nothing, the weather, the river, the new condos going up where the old fish market used to be. And then, quietly, carefully, you asked him about pelican and heron and kingfisher. About owl. Eddie went very still. His eyes, which had been drifting lazily around the bar, fixed on your face with an intensity that surprised you. He did not speak for a long time. The jukebox hummed its silent, broken hum. The ice shifted in his glass. Finally, he took a slow sip of his whiskey and set the glass down on the scarred wood of the bar. "Where did you hear those names?" he asked. His voice was quieter than you had ever heard it. You told him. Not everything, not yet. But enough. The crate. The ledger. The lighthouse. The radio. Your father's call sign. Eddie listened without interrupting. When you finished, he was silent again for a long moment. Then he nodded, almost to himself, and took another sip of his whiskey. "Those were the bird boats," he said. "That's what we called them. Pelican, heron, kingfisher, osprey. Your father was owl. And there were others. Sparrow. Raven. Cormorant." He shook his head slowly. It was a network. A shipping network, but not the kind you put on the books. They moved things the government couldn't move through regular channels. Money. Equipment. Medical supplies. Things that needed to get to places that didn't officially exist. It started during the war and just kept going. After the war, after Korea, after Vietnam. It never really stopped. Just changed names. Changed hands. You asked him how he knew all this. Eddie looked at you for a long moment. Then he reached into his back pocket and pulled out a worn leather wallet. He opened it carefully, his thick fingers clumsy with age, and extracted a photograph. It was old, black and white, faded to sepia, its edges creased and soft. He slid it across the bar to you. The photograph showed 3 young men in work clothes, standing on a dock. On the left was your father, young and strong, his arms slung around the shoulders of the man beside him. On the right was a man you had never seen before, tall and dark-haired, with a cigarette tucked behind his ear. And in the middle, holding a wooden crate, the same size and shape as the crate that had been delivered to your dock in the fog, was Eddie. You turned the photograph over. On the back, in handwriting you recognized, was a date. April 1973. And beneath it, a single line, last voyage of the Kingfisher. Eddie picked up his glass and held it to the light, watching the amber liquid swirl. Your father wasn't just a watchman, he said quietly. He was the one who made sure the shipments got through. And that crate you found, that was the last one. The one that never got delivered. He paused, and his eyes met yours. Until now. The photograph from Eddie's wallet was still burning in your mind as you walked back to the dock. 3 young men in work clothes, standing on the pier in 1973. Your father on the left, young and strong, his arms slung around Eddie's shoulders with the easy confidence of a man who had found his place in the world. Eddie in the middle, holding a wooden crate, the same size and shape as the crate that had been delivered to your dock in the fog, the same rough pine boards, the same square-headed nails. And on the right, a tall, dark-haired stranger whose name you still did not know, a man with a cigarette tucked behind his ear and a faint, knowing smile on his lips. The last voyage of the Kingfisher. The last shipment. The one that never got delivered. The fog was returning as you reached the tool shed, drifting in thin ribbons across the gravel path, curling around the pilings like the ghosts of old sailors who had never quite found their way home. The single bulb above the shed door glowed dimly through the mist, a pale amber beacon in the thickening gray. The river was quiet tonight, the water low and slow, the only sound the gentle lap of wavelets against the wooden piles and the distant, mournful call of a foghorn somewhere out on the shipping channel. You unlocked the door and stepped inside, pulling the cord on the overhead lamp. The yellow light flickered once, twice, and then steadied, casting its familiar pool of warmth across the workbench. The crate still sat where you had left it, its lid propped against the wall, its contents, the bundles of old money wrapped in oil paper, the ledger with its careful columns of dates and cargoes, the brass key with the number 1982 engraved on its handle, spread out around it like the pieces of a puzzle you were only beginning to assemble. You had been so focused on the ledger and the key that you had not examined the crate itself closely enough. Not really. You had been distracted by the money, by the strange symbols, by the W. 8 of discovery. But Eddie's words echoed in your mind, clear and insistent. That crate you found, that was the last one. The one that never got delivered. And your father had been the one who was supposed to deliver it. You lifted the empty crate off the workbench and turned it over in your hands. The rough pine boards were cool and damp to the touch, still carrying the faint scent of the river and the fog. The square-headed nails were old and rusted, their heads slightly raised where the wood had warped over the years. The chalk symbol on the lid, the circle, the bird, the key, had smeared slightly from your handling, but it was still visible, still mysterious. You had studied all of these things before. But now, running your fingers along the inside of the crate, feeling every joint and seam and corner, you felt something you had missed. A gap. A slight unevenness between the bottom board and the side wall, just barely wider than the others. It was subtle, so subtle that you might never have noticed it if you had not been looking. But you were looking now. You pressed on the board with your thumb, and it shifted. Just a fraction of an inch. Just enough to tell you that it was not fixed in place like the others. It was a false bottom. You worked the board loose with the tip of the crowbar, the old tool familiar and solid in your hand. The nails gave with a soft, reluctant creak, and the board lifted away, revealing a shallow compartment beneath. And there, flat against the true bottom of the crate, protected from the decades by the layer of wood and the bundles of money above it, was a single sheet of paper. It was a cargo manifest. Typed on thin, yellowed paper, the kind used for shipping documents in the days before everything went digital. The paper was brittle at the edges, and the ink had faded from black to a soft, watery brown, but the words were still legible. The letterhead at the top of the page read Pacific Rim Medical Supply in faded serif letters, and below it was a list of goods. The list was long and detailed, each item catalogued with the precision of someone who understood that lives depended on what was in those crates. Surgical kits, complete with scalpels and clam. PS and sutures. Field dressings, the kind used to pack wounds and stop bleeding in places where there were no hospitals. Broad-spectrum antibiotics, enough to treat infections in 100 patients. Plasma, packed in insulated containers, ready to be administered to the wounded and the dying. All of it destined for a port in Southeast Asia, a place whose name you recognized, a name that had been in the news for years, a name that had been synonymous with war and suffering and the slow, grinding destruction of everything that mattered. The shipment had been intended for a hospital. A hospital that, you knew from the history books and the old newsreels, had been bombed before the supplies could arrive. Bombed, and burned, and left in ruins, with nothing but the ghosts of the patients and the doctors who had once walked its corridors. At the bottom of the manifest, below the typed list and the official stamps and the shipping codes, was a note. It was written by hand, in ink that had faded over the years to a pale, rusty brown, the color of dried blood, the color of old grief. The handwriting was your father's. You knew it instantly, the same careful, deliberate hand that had filled the ledger and the codebook and the note about the lighthouse. Payment held pending release of funds. And beside it, a signature. Your father's name. Dated 1975. You read the words again, and each time they settled deeper into your chest. The money in the crate, the $50,000 in old bills, the bundles of currency wrapped in oil paper, the relics of banks that no longer existed, was not smuggled cash. It was not criminal proceeds. It was the payment. The funds that had been frozen, held back by some distant bureaucratic machinery that no longer mattered, in a world that no longer existed. The money had been meant to pay for the medical supplies. And the medical supplies had been meant to save lives. And your father had been the one who was supposed to make sure it all went through. But something had stopped him. A regulation. A frozen account. A war that had no patience for paperwork. Whatever the reason, the payment had never been released. The shipment had never left the dock. And your father had carried that knowledge for the rest of his life. He had written a note in his own hand. He had signed his own name. And then he had placed the manifest in the false bottom of the crate, hidden beneath the money that should have paid for the supplies, and he had waited. He had waited for the funds to be released. He had waited for the shipment to be cleared. He had waited for someone to come along and finish what he had started. Let these numbers and these names settle quietly in your mind now. The manifest is old. The money is old. They have waited at the bottom of this crate for decades, and they will not mind waiting a little longer. Close your eyes. Let the sound of the river carry you for a while, gentle and slow, like a hand smoothing down a crumpled page. You sat there on the old wooden stool, the manifest resting on your knee, the river lapping against the pilings outside. The fog had thickened again, pressing against the small window of the shed like something alive. The stacks of old money surrounded you on the workbench, their muted colors soft in the yellow light. And you understood, at last, what the crate really was. It was not a treasure. It was a burden. A burden that your father had carried for the last years of his life, and that had now passed to you. The shipment had never left. But it still could. The money was still here. The manifest was still here. And somewhere out there, perhaps, the hospital had been rebuilt. The war had ended. The wounds had healed. But the debt remained. And the choice of what to do with it, to let it rest, or to set it free, was now yours. The money had a story. Every dollar of it, every faded bill with its intricate engravings and its obsolete bank names, was a thread in a tapestry that had been woven decades before you were born. And you were determined to unravel it. The names on the old currency were your first clue. Banks that had failed during the Depression. Banks that had been bought and sold and merged into larger institutions, their original identities erased, their histories forgotten. You spent the daylight hours of the next several days following those names, tracing them through libraries and archives and the dusty back rooms of county record offices. You sat at long wooden tables in the public library, scrolling through microfilm reels of old newspapers, the reader emitting its soft, rhythmic hum. You made phone calls to the State Banking Commission, waiting on hold while clerks dug through files that had not been touched in years. You drove to the state capitol and spent an afternoon in the basement of the Historical Society, surrounded by boxes of documents that smelled of dust and old paper and the faint, sweet scent of decay. The trail was old and cold, but it was still there. And it all led back to a single source. A small bank called Riverbend Trust. Chartered in 1946, in the optimistic years after the war, when the city was growing and the docks were busy and the river was still a highway for commerce. Its headquarters had been a modest brick building on a cobblestone street in the old financial district, a street that was now lined with coffee shops and boutiques. The building itself was still there, but the bank was long gone. It had been acquired in 1974 by a larger regional bank, one of those quiet, efficient consolidations that swept through the industry in the 1970s, swallowing the small institutions like a whale swallowing minnows. That regional bank had itself been acquired in the 1980s, and that acquirer had been swallowed in turn by one of the financial giants that now dominated the skyline downtown. But beneath all those layers of corporate history, beneath the mergers and the acquisitions and the rebrandings and the consolidations, the records of Riverbend Trust still existed. They were stored in an archive warehouse on the edge of the city, a vast, dim space filled with rows of gray metal filing cabinets and shelves of cardboard boxes and cabinets of microfilm that stretched back decades. You drove there on a gray Thursday afternoon, the sky low and heavy with the promise of more rain. The warehouse was in an industrial park near the old airport, a place of loading docks and chain-link fences and the distant sound of trucks on the highway. The archivist was a small, precise woman in her 60s, with silver spectacles that perched on the end of her nose and a quiet, methodical manner that suggested she had spent a lifetime bringing order to chaos. Her name was Mrs. Calloway, and she had worked in this warehouse for more than 30 years. She listened to your request without expression, her pale eyes studying your face as you explained what you were looking for, the records of a trust account, opened in 1975, under your father's name. She asked no questions. She simply nodded, turned, and disappeared into the labyrinth of filing cabinets. You waited. The warehouse was silent except for the low hum of the fluorescent lights overhead and the occasional distant click of a door opening and closing somewhere in the depths of the building. The air was cool and dry, climate-controlled to preserve the fragile documents stored within. You sat in a hard plastic chair beside Mrs. Calloway's desk, watching the rain begin to fall outside the high windows, streaking the glass with silver. Nearly an hour passed. And then Mrs. Calloway returned, pushing a small cart. On the cart was a single cardboard box. The box was old, its corners reinforced with yellowed tape, its lid slightly dusty. A label on the side read, Riverbend Trust, Trust Accounts, 1975. She set the box on her desk and removed the lid. Inside, nestled among files and folders that had not been touched in decades, was a single manila folder. It was thin, just a few pages, their edges yellowed with age. But it was what you had been looking for. The folder contained the records of a trust account. The account had been opened in 1975, the same year the manifest was dated, the same year your father had writ. The note about the frozen funds. The amount deposited was $50,000. Not $50, $50,000. A substantial sum in those days, enough to buy a house, enough to start a business, enough to change a life. And the account had never been touched. Never withdrawn. Never transferred. Never liquidated. While other accounts at Riverbend Trust were cashed out or seized or absorbed into the acquiring bank's assets during the merger, this one had been left alone. The file noted only that the funds were held in trust, pending the arrival of the designated beneficiary. The interest had compounded, year after year, decade after decade, until the original $50,000 had grown to nearly $500,000. And clipped to the inside of the folder, written on letterhead that had yellowed with age, was a note. It was handwritten in ink that had faded over the years to a pale, rusty brown, the color of dried leaves, the color of old blood, the color of ink that had been waiting a very long time to be read. The handwriting was not your father's. It was more formal, more precise, the hand of someone who had spent a lifetime in offices, who had signed thousands of documents and written thousands of letters. The note read, "These funds do not belong to the bank. They belong to the client. The client is deceased. Hold until the client's named successor comes to claim them. Do not touch." The signature at the bottom was the bank president's. A name you did not recognize. A man who had been dead for years, probably, but who had once sat in an office in that modest brick building and made a decision that would echo across the decades. He had protected this money. He had ensured that it would survive the merger, the acquisition, the consolidation, the passage of time. He had written a note, clipped it to a file, and placed it in a box, trusting that someday, someone would come looking for it. The rain had stopped. The warehouse was silent. Mrs. Calloway had gone back to her desk, leaving you alone with the box and the folder and the letter. You looked at the name of the client, the person who had entrusted this money to the bank, who had set up this account, who had ensured that it would survive mergers and acquisitions and the passage of decades. It was your father's name, written in the same careful hand that had filled the ledger and the codebook and the note about the lighthouse. He had been here. He had done this. And he had left it for you. You sat there for a long time, the folder open in your lap, the letter resting on top of it. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Outside the high windows, the clouds were beginning to break apart, and thin shafts of pale sunlight were slanting down through the gaps, illuminating the dusty floor of the warehouse. You thought about your father, not the father of your childhood, the quiet man who had walked the dock at night and come home at dawn smelling of the river. The other man. The one you were only now beginning to know. The watchman who had guarded more than a dock. The courier who had carried more than cargo. The father who had left you a ledger and a key and a crate full of money and a trust that had been waiting, patiently, for you to come and claim it. Not because he wanted you to be rich, but because he wanted you to finish what he had started. The key to your father's past had been sitting above your head for 15 years, and you had never known it. After his funeral, you had packed his belongings into a few cardboard boxes, the things you couldn't bear to throw away, the things you weren't sure what to do with. His pipe. His wristwatch, the crystals scratched from years of wear. A handful of photographs. And a small wooden trunk, the kind sailors once used to carry their possessions from ship to shore. You had carried it up the narrow stairs to the attic, pushed it into a corner beneath the eaves, and left it there. For 15 years, it had sat undisturbed, gathering dust, waiting. Now, with the rain drumming softly on the roof above you and the house quiet around you, you climbed those stairs again. The attic was cold and dim, lit only by a single bare bulb that swung gently on its cord when you pulled the chain. The air smelled of old wood and mothballs and the faint, sweet scent of whatever flowers had bloomed in the garden the summer your mother was still alive. The trunk was where you had left it, tucked beneath the sloping rafters, its surface gray with dust. You knelt beside it and lifted the lid. Inside, beneath a folded sweater and a box of fishing tackle, was your father's personal journal. It was smaller than the ledger from the tool shed, bound in worn canvas rather than leather. It had not been meant for anyone else's eyes. This was not the official record of a watchman's duties, not the carefully coded log of shipments and signals. This was something else. A diary. A confession. A letter to himself. You sat down on an old wooden crate beneath the attic's single window and began to read. The early entries were ordinary enough, notes about the weather, the river, the small routines of a watchman's life. But as the pages turned, the story began to emerge. The medical supplies. The aid organization. The war. He wrote about it all with a quiet, methodical precision that you recognized from the L. Edger. The shipment had been arranged through a network of contacts he had built over years, the same network that used the code names in the Lighthouse book. The supplies were purchased with funds that had been raised from donors who wished to remain anonymous. The destination was a hospital in a war zone, a place that had been begging for help. And then, at the last moment, the funds had been frozen. The payment held. The shipment grounded. He had tried everything. Letters. Phone calls. Appeals to the bank, to the shipping company, to anyone who might have the authority to release the money. But the war had its own logic, and bureaucracy had its own inertia, and neither of them cared about a small shipment of medical supplies bound for a hospital that no one in power had ever heard of. So he had hidden the money in the crate, tucked the manifest into the false bottom, and waited for the war to end. But the war did not end. And before it could, he fell ill. The last entries in the journal were written in a hand that trembled slightly, the ink less steady than before. He knew he was running out of time. And so, on the final page, he wrote a letter. Not to himself. To you. You unfolded it carefully, the paper brittle with age. His handwriting was weaker here, but still legible. He told you about the crate. About the shipment. About the code names and the lighthouse and the radio. And he told you what to do. When you are old enough, he wrote, if the shipment is still there, find a man called Heron. He will know what to do. The letter was signed with his name and his code name. Owl. You had never received this letter. But you were reading it now. And the man called Heron, Eddie, the old dockworker at the harbor bar, was still alive. He was waiting. Just as your father had been waiting. Just as the crate had been waiting. The time had come. The fog was thinner the next morning, as if the river itself knew that something had shifted. It hung in pale, drifting ribbons above the water, catching the first gray light of dawn, curling around the pilings of the dock like the slow breath of some ancient creature. The air was cold and clean, and the sky overhead was the color of fresh ice. You walked through the quiet streets of the dock district, past the warehouses and the shuttered fish markets, past the harbor bar with its dark windows and its silent jukebox, until you reached 3rd Street and the narrow staircase that led up to Eddie's apartment above the laundromat. The building smelled of soap and steam and the faint, pleasant mustiness of old wood. You climbed the stairs slowly, your father's letter folded in the pocket of your coat, its paper worn soft from being read and reread. Eddie's door was at the end of the hall. You knocked, and a voice from inside told you to come in. The apartment was a single room with a sloping ceiling and a window that looked out over the rooftops toward the river. It was modest but tidy, a worn armchair with a blanket folded over its back, a small kitchen table with a single chair, a bed pushed against the far wall beneath a shelf of paperback novels. A hot plate sat on the counter, and a pot of coffee was perking, filling the room with its dark, bitter aroma. Eddie was sitting in the armchair, a blanket over his knees, the morning paper folded on the side table beside a pair of reading glasses with bent frames. He looked up as you entered, and his eyes, pale and watery with age, but still sharp, met yours. He did not seem surprised to see you. He seemed, rather, like a man who had been expecting someone for a very long time and was relieved that they had finally arrived. You handed him your father's letter without a word. He put on his glasses, adjusting them carefully on his nose, and read. His lips moved slightly as he worked through the words, his expression unreadable. The radiator hissed in the corner, its metal ticking as it cooled. A truck rumbled past on the street below, its engine echoing off the brick walls of the buildings. The coffee pot gurgled and fell silent. When Eddie finished, he folded the letter with the same care your father had used to write it, and he handed it back to you. Then he was quiet for a very long time. He stared out the window at the gray winter sky, at the distant gleam of the river between the rooftops. His hands, gnarled and spotted with age, rested on the blanket in his lap. Your father and I, he said at last, his voice low and rough, we were the last ones. The others had already gone, one by one. Pelican moved south in the late 70s, took a job in a shipyard in Louisiana, never heard from him again. Kingfisher got sick. Some kind of cancer, I don't remember. He was gone by 81. Osprey just disappeared one day. Didn't tell anyone. Didn't leave a note. Just walked away from the dock and never came back. But Owl and Heron, he paused, and a faint, sad smile crossed his weathered face. That was your father and me. Owl and Heron. We stayed. We were the ones who believed in it. The ones who thought it mattered. He pushed himself up from the armchair, his old joints protesting with a series of small, soft cracks. He walked slowly to the bed in the corner of the room, his footsteps heavy on the creaking floorboards. With a low groan, he knelt down and reached underneath, into the shadows beneath the iron bed frame. You heard the scrape of wood against wood, and then he was pulling something out. A wooden crate. The same size and shape as yours. The same rough pine boards, darkened with age. The same square-headed nails, their heads slightly raised where the wood had warped over the years. The same chalk symbol on the lid, the circle, the bird, the key, faded now to a ghostly white, barely visible against the gray wood. I was Heron, Eddie said, his voice barely above a whisper. He rested one hand on the crate, his thick fingers tracing the edge of the lid. Still am, I suppose. This was my shipment. The one I was supposed to deliver. It's been under my bed for 40 years. 40 years, waiting for someone to come and take it. He looked up at you, and his eyes were damp, the lines around them deeper than before. After your father died, I didn't have the heart to keep going. I didn't know where to find you. Your mother had moved. I looked for you, I swear I did, but I couldn't find you. So I kept it. All these years. I kept it, hoping that someday you'd come looking. And you did. It took 40 years, but you did. He reached into his back pocket and pulled out his worn leather wallet, the same one he had shown you at the harbor bar. He extracted the photograph, the three young men on the dock, your father on the left with his arms slung around Eddie's shoulders, Eddie in the middle holding the wooden crate with the chalk symbol on its lid, and the tall, dark-haired stranger on the right. He turned it over in his hands, his fingers gentle on the creased edges. Then he flipped it to the back and held it out to you. There was the date. April 1973. Last voyage of the Kingfisher. The handwriting was your father's, the same careful, deliberate strokes that filled the ledger and the code book and the note in the bank file. But beneath that line, in smaller writing, added later, was another sentence. You had not seen it before. You had not thought to look closely enough. For my son. When you see this picture, the light on the dock should still be burning. You looked up from the photograph. Outside the window, the fog was lifting. The last pale ribbons of it were dissolving into the cold morning air, and the sun was breaking through the clouds in long, slanting shafts of gold. The river glittered in the distance, its surface catching the light like 1,000 scattered coins. Eddie was watching you, his old eyes steady and bright. The crate sat on the floor between you, its chalk symbol glowing faintly in the growing light. The dock was still there. The light was still burning. And now, after 40 years, the final shipment was ready to be delivered. The two crates sat side by side on the workbench in the tool shed, their lids propped against the wall, their contents spread out in neat stacks beneath the yellow glow of the overhead lamp. Your father's crate. Eddie's crate. Between them, they held the remnants of a mission that had begun nearly half a century ago, a mission that had been interrupted by war and bureaucracy and the slow, quiet passage of time, but that had never been abandoned. Not by your father. Not by Eddie. And not, you realized, by the people who had been waiting for these supplies all along. Finding the aid organization was easier than you expected. Their name was on the manifest, Pacific Rim Medical Supply, and when you searched for it online, you discovered that it had not disappeared. It had grown. It had moved its headquarters to Geneva in the 1980s, expanded its operations across 3 continents, and changed its name slightly. But it was still there. Still doing the same work. Still sending medical supplies to places that the rest of the world had forgotten. You sent an email to the address listed on their website, not knowing if anyone would read it, not knowing if anyone would believe what you had to tell them. The reply came within hours. A brief, formal note from a senior administrator, asking for more details. You sent them the manifest. You sent them the photographs. You told them about your father, and about Eddie, and about the code names and the lighthouse and the radio. And then you waited. The response, when it came, was not what you expected. A delegation would be sent, the administrator wrote. 2 representatives from the organization would fly in from Europe to meet with you. To collect the shipment. To close the file. They arrived on a gray Tuesday morning, a man and a woman in dark coats, carrying briefcases and wearing the slightly bewildered expressions of people who had just traveled halfway around the world to collect a package that had been waiting for them since before. They were born. You met them at the dock. You showed them the crates, the manifest, the ledger. You told them the story, all of it, from the foggy night when the hand had reached out of the darkness and left the first crate on the pier. They listened in silence, their faces unreadable. And then the woman, who had introduced herself as the organization's director of logistics, reached out and touched the stack of old medical supplies with a gentleness that surprised you. These supplies, she said quietly, were meant for a hospital that no longer exists. It was destroyed in the war. But the war is over now. And there is another hospital, in another country, that needs them just as much. We will make sure they get there. The man, a legal officer, opened his briefcase and produced a stack of documents. Receipts. Releases. A formal acknowledgement of the trust that had been held for all these years. You signed them, and Eddie signed them, and the representative signed them. And with that, the trust was closed. The mission was complete. The shipment, at long last, was delivered. You walked the representatives back to their car. The fog was lifting, the sun breaking through in long, pale shafts that glittered on the surface of the river. You watched them drive away, and then you turned and walked to the lighthouse. The brass key with the number 1982 was still in your pocket. You climbed the spiral staircase one last time, your footsteps echoing on the iron steps. In the lantern room, the telegraph key was silent. The radio was dark. The great Fresnel lens stood in the center of the room, its brass fittings tarnished, its glass cracked. But the notebook was still on the table. Your father's codebook. You picked up the pencil that lay beside it, and on the last blank page, in the same careful hand that had filled the ledger and the manifest, you wrote the final entry. Owl log. All shipments delivered as of today. Watch complete. You closed the notebook. You descended the stairs. You walked back along the gravel path to the dock, where the river lapped softly against the pilings and the morning sun was spreading its gold across the water. In the tool shed, you placed the ledger back into the first crate, and the codebook into the second, and you closed their lids. You slid the crates onto the shelf where they would wait, as they had always waited, for whoever might need them next. Then you stepped outside and closed the door behind you. The fog was gone. The river glittered. And you walked home, your watch at an end.